Good evening, folks. Welcome. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre and to tonight's event, Forgotten Rebels. Did you know there's a Canadian punk band called Canadian Rebels?
I did, and they've got a hit on YouTube called Heroin. The things you learn from Google.
With an E or without?
Without.
Oh, okay. Not so relevant.
We might get them to address that.
Yeah, I think you should.
In the reprise, on the B-side.
I'm Robyn Annear, and I'm here tonight talking with Clare Wright. Let me tell you a little bit about Clare. Her book, as you know, is The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. Let me just stand it up so you can see what a beautiful thing it is. Clare is a historian who's worked, among other things, as a political speechwriter, university lecturer, historical consultant, and, as you probably know, radio and TV broadcaster. Her face is probably well known to you. Her first book, Beyond the Ladies' Lounge, Australia's Female Publicans, was a big hit. It garnered both critical and popular acclaim. She researched, wrote and presented the ABC television documentary series Utopia Girls, and is currently writing a 4-part series to commemorate the centenary of World War I for ABC One next year. So welcome, Clare.
Thanks, Robyn.
And congratulations on the Forgotten Rebels.
Thanks.
We're talking tonight more broadly than just about the Eureka Stockade, which is the ostensible subject of Clare's book. We're talking about who is written into history and who is not. But let me background a bit, because we will be touching on the Eureka Stockade and its events at many points, I'm sure, throughout our talk. So let me just background that event for you a little, and I'll just show you. Among my books is this little beauty called Fly a Rebel Flag, the Battle at Eureka, which was written for upper primary, junior, secondary students. So this is my own kind of brush with the Eureka story. The event known as Eureka Stockade was the bloody culmination of 3 years' unrest on the Victorian Goldfields. Diggers were overtaxed and over-policed. Unrest periodically flared up on every goldfield across the colony in reaction to the injustices of the licence system, not just the expense of the monthly gold licence, which in effect made poverty a crime, but the fact that it entitled diggers to no vote, no access to land. So apart from those injustices, also the brutality and the corruption of the authorities who administered it on the goldfields. But it was at Ballarat that the situation ignited. Growing agitation among the diggers had led to a build-up of military force in the government camp at the end of 1854. Both sides upped the ante. A group of diggers rallied under their own Australian flag, the Southern Cross, burned their licences, took an oath of solidarity. Then they armed themselves and retreated to a ramshackle stockade enclosing about an acre of ground, tents, stores, mine shafts and their inhabitants and all, on the Eureka lead. And they waited, but they didn't wait for long. Before dawn on Sunday, 3rd of December 1854, the military smashed the stockade. About 30 died, most of them on the diggers' side. And those are the particulars of the event. But the reputation of Eureka and what it stands for is for the birth of democracy in Australia. Much bigger than the
It's amazing it took me 500 pages to say what you've just...
There you go. That's a short version.
It's the executive summary.
I'm just going to disconnect. There's a shortage of stationery on the train meant that I used chewing gum to attach that to that very pithy...
I hope it was your chewing gum. You didn't pull it out from under the seat.
I didn't reach under the seat. That pithy summary to my main notes. Now, last night I watched the 1949 film of Eureka Stockade, starring your favourite actor and mine, Chips Rafferty, as Peter Lawler. Fantastic facial hair. I recommend it to anyone.
He was nearly sacked from that. They wanted Peter Finch to play it because they thought that Chips Rafferty was doing a rubbish job.
He's very wooden and very Australian.
No, they were very Irish. Disappointed with him, but they couldn't knock him out of his contract. So.
But as it was, I think Peter Finch made a distant kind of appearance as Humphrey on the...
He does. Bit player.
Yeah, and they booed him, what's more. And waved their guns at him. The voiceover preamble to it said, "The story of the world is something, I can't remember." And in that fight is a fight for freedom. And in that fight, England had her Magna Carta, France her revolution, America had her Declaration of Independence, Australia, ... the Eureka Stockade.
Do you know when it came out in America, they called it Massacre Hill?
Aha! It wasn't on a hill, it was in a valley. I was really surprised the military came down the hill and were sitting ducks. In fact, many more military were killed in that movie than...
Well, I think that it's a reference more to Bunker Hill, so, something that the Americans could get their mind around.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating
Massacre
to see
Hill.
what they made of it, yeah. So I was reminded in hearing that preamble, just yesterday in The Guardian's Australian Culture blog, you wrote, "Our national bedtime story, the popular imagining of our past, remains a stubbornly closed book, refusing to fracture the male militaristic fairy tale of virile adventure and blood sacrifice." And there it was, unfolding in black and white before me. And you asked the question early on in your book, where are we in the story? Tell me, Claire, where are we in the story?
Well, we're all over it. I mean, we're scattered through 500 pages of it. But that's not the impression that you would have gotten if you had read the literature on the Eureka Stockade for the last 150-odd years. There have been a couple of walk-on characters. Certainly in the film, that was the case. There was Alicia Dunn. She is Peter Lawler's fiancée at the time and later wife. And I think there's another role for Anastasia Hayes. And women were occasionally credited with making the flag. That's the only time they kind of come into the picture at all, which I think is interesting because it still sort of suggests that they can have this role, but sewing the flag is essentially a womanly task.
Absolutely.
And then there was an added extra that was given, and it was always suggested that the stars on the flag were made from the women's petticoats.
Yes.
So there was a kind of this sort of saucy frisson that was given to it. So it was kind of a female role that was traditional but also sexualised in a way that made it very palatable to the overall story. And yet no context as to who these women might have been who made the flag, why they were there, were there other women, or were there just three of them who happened to wander across, from stage left at the particular time when a flag was needed. So we weren't there. People may know the name Peter Lawler, they might know Raffaella Carboni. If you've delved into the history a bit more, you might know Humphrey. But do you know any of the names of any of the women who were there? Do you know that there was a woman killed in the stockade? No, these things weren't taught to us in school. And so that's really what I set out to address, because I knew that there were women there.
So you set out 10 years ago to do this. And what were among the surprises? I mean, let me feed you one. Breast pumps. I think breast pumps were a surprise to you, yeah?
They certainly, I think breast pumps are a surprise to everyone, particularly if you've ever tried to use one. It comes as a great surprise. Are you supposed to do that with that? No. But, I mean, this is part of my strategy. I mean, what I did was, when I first started this project, I had a number of my male colleagues in academia who said, what could you possibly have to say about Eureka that hasn't already been said? A very negative approach to the sense that the story had been done. Yeah. And that if you were going to do it again, the only way you could do it is if you found some startling new evidence, some kind of smoking gun, some pile of letters under a bed somewhere, someone had ripped down the palings of a house out in Buninyong to renovate it and found all these issues of the Ballarat Times that have been lost for 150 years, that would be the only way that you could rewrite the Eureka story. But in fact what I did was the way that I approach history in general, and certainly the way that I wrote my first book, Beyond the Ladies' Lounge, which was about Australia's female publicans. Again, a story that had been seen to be exclusively masculine, the pub as a male icon, and central to our Australian national identity. What I set out to do was to go back to the same archives that people had trawled through, but armed with a different set of questions. And when you go with a different set of questions, you come out with different answers. So I'm getting around to the breast pumps. So when...
They're paying attention, though.
I can see. And when I went back to the Ballarat Times a newspaper that has been absolutely poured over by everybody who's written about Eureka, and there have literally been dozens of historians and very well-known historians as well. Geoffrey Blaney's done it, Geoffrey Searle's done it, Manning Clark did it, John Maloney's done it. There's, nobody who hasn't touched on it. It's such a big story. They've all gone back to this Ballarat Times because it was the newspaper that was being printed in Ballarat at the time, and so it was really the on-the-spot chronicling of the events. And there were only a few extant copies left of it. So I went there and I was looking for things about the Ballarat Reform League and evidence about the flag and the sorts of things that others had looked for. But I also looked beyond that to the context of the articles. I was trying to recreate the community, the lived community. So I was also looking at the ads, and I was looking at one ad for a pharmacist who was selling. We've got to remember that this was a tent community at this stage, 1854. So there's 30,000 people in Ballarat and they're all living in tents. Their shops are essentially tents. And, a tent that's kind of divided, one side for sleeping, one side for selling. And in one of these pharmacy tents, I'm running my finger down the list of items that are being sold, and then I stopped with these two little words, breast pumps. And actually the next two words were nipple shields, if we're going to be thorough about it. And so right there, that pulls you up because you say, okay, they're selling breast pumps on the Goldfields of Ballarat. So if that's the case, clearly this fellow feels like he can turn a buck. There's a market for them. So if there's a market for these things, there must be enough women who are going to purchase a breast pump. Now, which women purchase breast pumps? Lactating women. And in particular, which lactating women? Generally the women who have lost their babies or their babies are ailing, failing to thrive and unable to suck in some way. So they're pumping their breasts to relieve mastitis. So right there and then, two little words open up a whole new set of questions. And then it was by that basic process that I was able to unravel and uncover a whole lot of evidence and stories and document a whole life that hadn't really been looked at before.
Some of the leading women that you draw out in the story, apart from just the women generally, I think, was it something around a third of the population was females?
That's right. So it was the statistical evidence as well that was really, really startling.
Just so striking, Claire.
Again, like Ladies' Lounge, one of the things that I discovered there was that by the turn of the 20th century, over 50% of Victoria's pubs were run by women. And, statistics are telling in that kind of way. I haven't got much of a maths head.
Yeah.
But just to know that a third of the population were women and children, it automatically changes the complexion of that community.
It absolutely does.
So instead of conceptualising the diggers, as I think we were taught in school, as being these kind of rugged individuals out on the frontier, having a knees up and living this kind of life of a rolling stone with this sort of freedom that they had that was particularly a womanless freedom.
Yes.
And sometimes we've been taught about the grass widows who'd been left behind in Ballarat, like the scum around the bathtub. They'd been kind of left behind. But suddenly you can start to see the Ballarat community not as a kind of industrial landscape and a kind of Hollywood Wild West, but a domesticated community. And I think that changes the very nature of the story you tell, because once you start to think about the psychology of those diggers and what was so frustrating to them, why, as you were explaining before, the licence tax was such a burden, why the method of its collection was so aggravating, and why the corruption and the injustice going on the diggings was such an insult. When you start to reconfigure those men as husbands and fathers, not just as rugged individuals, it really changes the psychology of the community, in fact, the whole psychology of that immigrant generation.
It does. It tells you such a lot about why they were there, what their aspirations were, why they'd taken that incredibly perilous journey across the sea, and what they were there hoping for, and how they were stymied in that progress, and progress being a big word in those times, stymied in their personal progress by the sorts of obstacles that were put in front of them in the form of the licence fee and their treatment, as you say, the insults which their wives and families were witness to, and the fact that they couldn't have access to land.
That's right. The land issue is very important.
So they couldn't start to grow, make lives in this country.
Right.
I think somebody actually said, was it Lawler? That was why they took up arms. That was why they burned their licences. We have to make this a land that we can live in, that we can make lives in.
And it's why the first 4 chapters of the book, I mean, there's actually only 2 pages of the book that are about the Stockade massacre itself. I felt on one level that event had been completely done over. In fact, I have a student who's just finished a master's degree at La Trobe University, Gregory Blake, who has written, in fact, before he did his master's, he did a whole book on that 10-minute battle. That's there's 250 pages on the battle. So if you want a forensic breakdown of what was going on, which way the bullets were flying and who was firing them and what sort of guns they were using.
And who fired first.
That all-important question. All of that is out there for you to find.
Sure.
But what I really wanted to do was, and why I spent 4 chapters, the first 4 chapters, was establishing who those people were. I really don't feel like you can understand what happened in that 10 minutes and why it happened without going back and taking that journey with the people. And so we start over the seas in England, in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, in all of the countries people were coming from, with a sense of what their expectations were, why they were taking, as you say, this incredibly perilous journey. And one of the chapters is just about the journey itself, where they've already lost babies. They've already lost any old people that they brought with them, and there hardly were any. It was an incredibly young population. And they had left everything behind. Why did they do it? They did it because they were seeking a better life. And part of that better life, it wasn't just an economic migration, that for many of these people what a better life meant was the opportunity for a social mobility and an ability to get on in life that was about merit, not about where you were born. So the old country represented this kind of strict hierarchies.
Yes.
Of birth determining your outcome in life.
They've been locked into it for generations.
That's right. And they were leaving that behind. And they were told that this was possible. So one of the things that I looked at was all of the guidebooks that were being written at the time, because there was a whole industry and people coming over, particularly in 1852, which you've written about so wonderfully, and 1853. And then going back to England quite quickly after a reasonably short sojourn in Victoria, and writing these guidebooks, which are kind of the Lonely Planet of the day, about what to bring, where to go.
And what not to bring.
And
pianos.
Yeah, pianos. Don't bring pianos.
Don't bring a piano.
And also saying things to the women who they were encouraging to come out. Don't bring your highfalutin attitudes. Don't bring your genteel skills of piano playing and decorative needlework and all your fancy languages. They're not needed out here. What's needed is hard work, dedication, an ability to get down and dirty, an ability to apply yourself to all tasks that might be. And if you do these things, you will succeed. And what they particularly said to men was that if you do these things, if you work hard, if you put your elbow to the ground, you will achieve, and this is a very important phrase, a manly independence. So the idea was that you could be a better husband, that you could be a better father.
And provider.
And a better provider, a better breadwinner, because gold would represent wealth, but it's actually what gold represented on a much wider symbolic level that was important to him. It would represent liberty. It would represent autonomy and sovereignty and a kind of freedom and independence that you didn't have in the old country to remake your life. And that message was spoken to women and also to men. And so I think it's really important to understand that, so that when everything starts to go wrong in Ballarat, then you understand how high their expectations were and how low they sank.
It's interesting. I think you've told me when we spoke the other day that you've already had a bit of pushback from some critics and bloggers and feedback about your audacity in making this a women's story, making what's essentially a men's story into a women's story. But by putting women in the picture, you are in fact dignifying the men and their rebellion, if you like. and as you say, putting it in context, and it does us well to bear that in mind as we read it. You talk about, can I quote you in your preface, the last line?
Yep.
The great gift of Eureka, and you said to me, for men as well as women, its beauty and in a sense its terror, is the story of women's effort, influence and sacrifice is both politically correct and historically true. I mean, I found that audacious, and I felt that you were being a bit provocative to your potential critics in stringing those two words together, politically correct, in such a prominent place in the book. Tell us about where that statement fits in for you.
I guess what I'm getting at there is that partly what you said before, is that it's not that I've anticipated pushback from people who are going to say, we've just had enough of you feminists telling us how bad men are all the time. And that is a comment that comes after a very short article in the Ballarat Times about my book last week. There's a whole series of comments from men in Ballarat saying things like that. We're so sick of you women telling us how bad men are. And you just think that they must feel like they're getting it from everywhere. You know, it's a real sense of threat. And that's what I mean by its beauty and its terror, is that some people are clearly threatened by the idea that you want to include women in our national story and that the way that we understand ourselves and how things were in the past. So on the one level, all I'm attempting to do is restore historical accuracy and veracity to an event that has been absolutely overtly mythologised. And so we're taught, it's not that it's not a legend. I think it should be a legend. I'm not trying to undermine the potency of the story by any means. But what I'm trying to do, to come back to what you said originally about where are we in the story, 50% of the people sitting in schools are girls. Yeah? And they deserve the opportunity to be able to identify themselves and where they belong with their national story as well, where they sit within that, rather to feel that they're excluded from it or alienated from it, or that it's just not about them. So what I mean by it's politically correct is that we can be socially inclusive about this story. Social inclusiveness, diversity, they're obviously kind of tag words of the now.
Yeah.
That are on one level very not romanticised but held up to be important, and I would agree with this, by one side of politics, and considered to be just politically correct, Chardonnay drinking, armchair feminism, university blabbing inner elites, or whatever you want to call, whatever that element of the media and politics want to call people who would like to see our stories more socially inclusive. What I'm suggesting is that social inclusion as an agenda is absolutely historically accurate in this context. And so we can have our cake and eat it too. I'm not making this shit up. These people really did live. These women really were there. That woman really did die in the Eureka Stockade.
And that in itself, can I come to that?
Yeah.
This is about your research and about looking at documents that have been looked at before. Now, your clue about, well, not just clue, the statement that a woman had died in the stockade came from a manuscript in the State Library of Victoria next door, which was quite well known, had been pored over by many scholars and researchers. Its author had been misidentified. It was called the Lazarus Diary, and you, in the course of your research, correctly identified the author. But there, in black and sepia, was the fact that this man had witnessed a woman's body being taken from the stockade for burial. How is that, something like that, not brought to the surface before? Well,
that's exactly the question, and this diary has been pored over. It's been used by everybody who's written about Eureka, certainly in the last 20 or so years when this diary has been in public hands. It was in private hands before that. But it was known as the Lazarus Diary, and as you suggest, through my research, I actually realised that I was going through it very carefully, and I published about it earlier as the Lazarus Diary. And then when I actually went back to that diary, I was doing some work for Sovereign Hill on a new orientation centre that they're building up there, and I was a consultant to that project, and I was compiling profiles of about a dozen Gold Rush immigrants. And when I went back to the diary, not looking for clues about Eureka, but actually just trying to understand who this Samuel Lazarus was, I had to go at a certain point, this isn't Samuel Lazarus. This just doesn't add up. There are so many holes in this. So that sent me on a kind of 4-month spiral, a sort of history detective kind of thing, which is, every historian's dream on one level, and then in a complete nightmare on another.
A huge
distraction. My kids were like, if you say the word Lazarus one more time, but because I was obsessed. And I was able to, and actually it was funny, I was in the State Library one day, and I buttonholed Shane Carmody, who was at the time the Director of Collections here. He's recently left. And I had just had a big session on the Lazarus Diary, and I said, Shane. And he was actually showing the head of the Bodleian Library around. It was when they had that manuscripts collection here, that illuminated manuscripts. I said, Shane, I don't think the Lazarus Diary is written by Samuel Lazarus. And he gave me this look like, move away from the crazy historian, move away from... And he told me later, he thought I was going to say it was a fake and the State Library had spent all this money. But in fact, I was able to prove that it wasn't Samuel Lazarus. I was able to prove that it was Charles Evans, and then I was able to kind of pin down why the mistaken provenance had been made, and it now has been reclassified in the library. But the thing that was so fascinating about it was that so many people had used this particular source, and yet nobody had highlighted the fact that he very clearly says, on the 4th of December, it's not like it's kind of buried somewhere back in November or way off in 1855. It's on the 4th of December, the morning after, he says, one of the most sorrowful events was watching the funeral procession of a woman who was mercilessly butchered while defending the life of her husband in the stockade. A long cortege of mourners. The coffin was trimmed in white, he says, and it causes him to completely recalibrate the moral universe that he thought that he grew up in, because he cannot believe that a British government could fire on innocent civilians that included women and children. And they knew that women and children were in there. So, we're in a way almost kind of immune to the fact that we hear about this with Indigenous populations all the time. But in a sense, this was a massacre of a white civilian population.
Yeah,
and the fact that no one had picked that up and run with it before, I don't know, there's one word for it, possibly. Germaine Greer would have a lot to say about the fact that patriarchy might have something to do with it, but I'm not here to give a lesson in gender studies.
Well, just the blindness that it indicates. But talking about the battle, now you said that there are books aplenty about it, including the 251 describing just the 10 minutes. And I've read a lot of them. But I was really struck by the way that you told the story of that 10 minutes and what followed, the reprisals and the wanton destruction and violence displayed by the soldiers after they arrested the rebels and carted them off. They spread throughout the entire area, not just the stockade, but the entire Diggings neighbourhood.
Burned it to the ground.
Burning tents at will, regardless of whether they had people in them or not. And the accounts that you draw to the surface of women who had near misses and families were extraordinary. And I'd never seen them elsewhere. And it was incredibly vivid, and the sort of description that you'd expect to see or hear on a current day documentary of atrocities committed in some far off place. And I've never seen it couched in those terms. And it must help. It must make it the more vivid because you have drawn women so much to the forefront of the story up to that point where every woman seems to be either pregnant or lactating. And it makes sense. Once Claire tells you the story, she tells you the figures, and you get it in your head that this was a young population. These were all young marrieds. That's why those women were there.
Or young unmarrieds. There are a lot of ex-nuptial pregnancies going on as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the other kind of statistical research that I did in crunching the numbers of the birth, deaths and marriage records and the censuses and the figures that were being parlayed back from the Gold Commission offices in Ballarat back to Melbourne Central, which happened every month. They call them the monthly returns. And I make the point that there was a baby boom going on in Ballarat in 1854 and 1855, and it's extraordinary. So in 1851 there's like one baby born in Ballarat, in 1852 there's half a dozen, in 1853 there's 12, and in 1854 there's over 700, and in 1855 there's twice that number. So, there were all these single people, men and women, coming out, and they're at the start of their lives and they're getting together. And there's a lot of rooting going on in Ballarat. So you do get the sense that this is a really young, vital community at the beginning of everything. And that so many of these men, you said that the licence tax made poverty a crime, which is really, what they were so aggrieved about, that it was essentially a poll tax. It was a fee for being there, that they didn't get any services for it, and this is one of the main grievances. Food was incredibly expensive because there were no made roads, so in winter when everything got boggy, the prices of everything skyrocketed, and so they were trying to feed babies, trying to feed their new wives, and there are incredibly grisly accounts, and I include some of them. This is the part that my husband said, I don't know whether I can even read this bit, of wives dying in childbirth and their babies dying in their tents. And there's one incredible autopsy, coronial inquiry that I read, where the magistrate who is conducting the coronial inquiry says, why didn't you go for a doctor? And the man says, because we didn't have a blessed sixpence in the tent.
Yeah.
So, I'm trying to understand what that felt like for those men. So it's not just about the women. It's essentially a people's history. It's about what happens when you put the women back in. It's not about the women per se, but how does it feel? What does it feel like for that fella to be so poor after being told that he was going to be like the king of the castle, to watch his wife dying because her uterus is hanging outside her body, excuse me, but that's actually, the details that are going through, and the baby is dying through lack of nutrition and lack of care. It's those kinds of details that to me help make sense of why they were so angry, why they were so incredibly frustrated that the government would not listen to all the constitutional means that they were going through, that these diggers, to try to get justice and try to have their voices heard. So it is about that wider picture of humanity. And yet I guess I'm also trying to bring to the fore the individual women who were so important in the leadership of that movement as well.
And that's so beautiful. That was going to be my next...
Oh, nice segue.
we couldn't have planned that. If your daughter or mine were at school in being one of the 50% of a typical class, and were asked, for instance, now that somebody, their teachers and others, have read your book, and were asked to choose a character in the Eureka story to assume or to write about, they could choose a woman now. They could choose from a multitude of women, but some women in particular who played major roles in this, you've drawn to the surface. And again, one's got to ask, where have they been all this time? But tell us, I'm thinking in particular Clara Seacamp, Ellen Young, the Ballarat poetess, and Sarah Hanmer. Sarah Hanmer in particular, how can she be overlooked in her respectability, in her business credentials and so forth? Tell us a little bit about her.
And again, you don't have to scratch the surface or go very far to find Sarah, because she was advertising all the way through the Ballarat Times. So, practically next to that ad for the pharmacy is an ad for Sarah Hanmer's Adelphi Theatre. Every week she's putting another ad in, or there is some report about a play that has been held at her theatre. So, you know, it's not like this is kind of rocket science. It's all there. And Sarah Hanmer was just an extraordinary woman. She came to Victoria with her daughter. Sarah had clearly was a single mum. She put her age down significantly when she arrived in Victoria, which I discovered a number of women did. It was in an age before passports and Myki cards and every other form of identification that you carry around with you. You can get on the boat in Liverpool and be 35, and you can get off the boat in Melbourne and miraculously be 26, because that's what you tell the immigration official. And it's not until some pesky historian comes along 150 years later and gets your death certificate and starts doing the maths that you realise there's a discrepancy there. But it's, you know, it's symbolic of the fact that these people were rewriting their own stories. So Sarah arrives. She had been an actress in Britain, and she had clearly been to the Goldfields in America and done some sort of tour there. She comes back via Britain to Australia. She arrives with her daughter Julia, and she starts the Adelphi Theatre in Ballarat. And this quickly becomes a thriving place of socialisation in Ballarat. And again, another one of those amazing little facts that I found was that when you went to the theatre in Ballarat, if you're going for a night out, they provided childcare. There was a tent off to the side where they would employ some young women to look after the babies for the night, and the women would rush in, breastfeed, go back out and have a bit more of a dance or play some more cards. I mean, you know, it was really a time, that's how many women there were, and these women wanted to have fun. They weren't content to be left back in their tents. In the tent, content. And so Sarah Hanmer was putting on these shows. She was an extremely reputable part of the community. She seemed to be universally adored, particularly by the Americans, and her theatre became the headquarters of the American portion of the population over the time of the Troubles, as it was later referred to. So when the Diggers started to organise towards a movement, this popular movement of democratic protest, her place became the headquarters, the American portion of it, which was very significant. And I also discovered that she was actually the chief financial backer of the Diggers. There was something called the Diggers Defence Fund. There's a list of all the contributions that people made to it, and she tops the list by a country mile. Yeah. And so it was the proceeds of her very profitable business as a theatre manager that was going to propping up this movement. And in fact, on December the 3rd, on the day that the massacre happened that morning, there was going to be a meeting of the Ballarat Reform League at the Adelphi Theatre at 2 p.m. that afternoon to come up with the next strategy, and of course we never got to that. So reconstructing Sarah's life and a number of these other women has been an absolute joy, and I think that you're right. I hope that girls are able to say, well, I'm going to talk about her and her life instead of being able to choose from 6 men that they want to, which is something that my primary school daughter regularly has to do when she does a history project. Choose from these 6 explorers, who all happen to be men, to tell us what they did in history that was so great and what they discovered and why they are important. Well, maybe they'll have some role models from history to say how women made things happen. And particularly because I should say that Text is publishing a young adult version of this book in a couple of years' time. So we're going to whittle this fat thing down to 50,000 words that will, with a young adult editor, that will help this book be more accessible to teachers and to students. And now that we have a national history curriculum, I think that that's important. Your book will no doubt be on it too, Robyn.
I can think of a few profanities that you could
I might have to cut out a little bit of the more colourful language, which is all historically appropriate.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, Claire, before we're going to open up to questions from the audience. But you made a remark to me when we spoke last. Monuments are important. There are monuments to the Eureka event in Ballarat, and there's a new one at the new Museum of Democracy at Eureka, which Claire had a significant hand in. And you said monuments are important. Tell me why, because I tend to think of them as not being important, but I'm interested to hear what you've got to say on that.
Okay. Monuments are important because they're the things that stick around. Books do too, but they are in stone, in situ, in places that people walk past. There has been a monument to the diggers who fell at Eureka in Ballarat from the very, very earliest years, and a list of the men who fell. Now, there was a comment that was made in response to that blog post in The Guardian that you just mentioned before. Someone wrote after that, "This is interesting, but there were no women mentioned on Peter Lawler's list of those who died, which is what is on the statue. Therefore, she hasn't got any evidence that a woman was killed. She's just making this up. You can't make stuff up just to further your own argument." So that list had come down in some way as to be the truth, because it's carved in stone, so therefore it must be true. When they were making the new Museum of Australian Democracy at Ballarat, which is the old Eureka Centre that has been reconformed as a Museum of Australian Democracy that revolves around the Eureka story, there was going to be a new plaque that was put up to the fallen. And fortunately, I was consulted on the wording of it, and the wording that they had initially said, "To the men who we knew died," and they list them, the same list that always goes out, "and to those who we don't know." To those men who we don't know, essentially, whose names we don't know. And I said, if you don't say now to the men and women whose names we don't know, because Charles Evans doesn't name that woman in his diary, and there are suggestions that other women died there as well, and I give them in the book. If you don't take this opportunity, it is an absolute missed opportunity, and you will be behind the scholarship, and you will be perpetuating a lie. And to their credit, I got a new script the next day that changed the wording, and this monument now says, "To the men and women whose names we don't know, we honour them as well." Now, everybody who passes there now will read that, and something will go ka-chink, ka-chink, ka-chink in their brain. I'm sure of that.
And this includes a lot of school groups. This is the sort of place school kids go.
So suddenly those questions open up. Two little words, "and women," open up all of those questions. Well, hang on. And you take it from there. I mean, history is nothing if it's not a process of inquiry. And if that monument stimulates inquiring minds to want to find out more about that, then job done.
Good. Nice work. We're going to open up to questions from you, if you're happy with that.
Absolutely.
And there goes a hand, right there.
Claire, I'm really thrilled that you've written this book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It sounds so inclusive. We're in it, yeah. Okay. I'm really pleased to hear that you went back to find the history of why people came here in the first place, because it seems to me that the Eureka Stockade is really a migration story, and those people came with high hopes of what to achieve. What parallels can you see between that happening in the days before passports and asylum seekers today?
Well, in the article that I published in The Guardian yesterday, I did call them European boat people. And quite deliberately so, because it does make that point. It also makes a wider point that these women came from a wide variety of backgrounds. And that is the other thing about Eureka, that there have been some inklings about that recently, but that this is our story in a much more socially inclusive way than just talking about the fact that there were women there. This isn't just about redressing a gender imbalance, but I also do make the point through the book and talk about some of the other immigrant groups that came as well. And so one of the things that I find so incredibly moving about the flag that's been so beautifully recreated on the front of this book, and that you can see now at the Museum of Australian Democracy at Ballarat, because it's now moved from the art gallery down to the ground where it was first flown and where it was constructed, is that at the time they called this the Australian flag. So we have since called it the Eureka flag, and the government at the time called it the rebel flag, but the people called it the Australian flag. And they did that because to them it represented the one thing that united everybody, across class, across gender, across race, across ethnicity, is that they looked up to this constellation that was the Southern Cross, that had been their kind of bearings as they moved from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere. It represented everything about what had changed and a world turned upside down. But it was the one thing that united all of them. It was quite deliberate. And I think, you know, for me, that's why when I go and stand in front of that flag, all the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, because I really do feel like that material embraces us all.
Hi Claire, how you going?
Very well, and yourself?
Yeah, good. My name's Charlie, by the way.
Thanks for coming along, Charlie.
No worries. I just wanted to ask you, because something I kept sort of hearing when you were talking is about how obvious a lot of these new things you were finding were and how easy they were to come across. Do you think that other historians have actively ignored these facts, or it's just... why hasn't it come up before? Why is it new if it's so easy to find?
I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think that there's... I don't think it's an act of negligence by any means. I just don't think people thought it was relevant to the story, that they were kind of frivolous details. In fact, one of my dear colleagues at La Trobe University, John Hurston, he wouldn't mind me saying this because that's the kind of fella he is. When I first went to start to talk to him about this, the research of this came out of my postdoctoral research fellowship funded by the Australian Research Council. When I first went to talk to him about it, he sort of said, oh, well, if you want to do this window dressing on history, then fine, you know, come and join us here at La Trobe. And, you know, I appreciated that about John because he was honest about it. And actually that is an underlying assumption that a lot of people have. So when I say it's not hard to find, it's not, because you could go and after this session into the State Library and go to the microfilm and you'll find the same thing about breast pumps in the Ballarat Times as I did. But why I spent 10 years and 540 pages is because I think that well, firstly, it's just such a great story and I couldn't shut up about it. And there was so much to tell. In fact, I cut 50,000 words out of the initial manuscript. There's so much more that could be said about it. And I just you know, wanted to get that story out. But the reason, in a sense, that the thoroughness was necessary was because people will, and I know this about women's history because I've done a lot of it, they will want to pick the holes in it. They will want to dismiss it. They will want to say that it's frivolous or it's a kind of frippery in some kind of way. And it's not. It is as important a part of the story. It's not a let's just add a bit of colour to it with these women. So I don't think people have deliberately ignored it. I just don't think they thought it was important.
Claire, thanks for an important book. Now, I'm interested in the texts of the time, like the newspapers, the journals. How did they report women at the time? Do you think there was a sort of a manipulation of the discourse to the extent that women were written out? Or, I guess that's my question.
Can I just ask you, do you mean immediately after the Stockade massacre itself or in the whole context of the time?
The whole, what was going on at the time, the problems that the people had on the Goldfields, and leading up, the things that led up to the actual conflict.
Yes.
And then the aftermath.
Okay.
I mean, were women dealt with as having a part in this? Or were they just written out of the story completely? And if they were written out of the story completely, who might have been responsible for that? and who might be manipulating the discourse in that way and why?
I'm with you. They absolutely were not written out at the time. And that's for a number of reasons. In fact, quite the obverse. So many commentators were actively observing how many women were there. It was actually something that everybody remarked upon, particularly people who had been to California before and had seen how few women were on the goldfields there. The figure is about 10% for the California gold rushes. And so many of these diggers had been to California before they came to Victoria. So there were many observers who were remarking about what an orderly place Ballarat was, that it thrummed with domesticity, and that how pleasant it was to have women who were there and how busy they were, actively working as shopkeepers, as laundresses, as boarding house keepers, selling the alcohol, providing the entertainment, providing all sorts of services for the young mobile male digging population there, and how much more enjoyable it was to have women there with them. It was the zeitgeist to comment on it in that way. So they were not written out by any stretch. At the same time, I want to say that women were contributing to the press. So one of the other things, and two of the women that Robyn mentioned before, Clara Seacamp and Ellen Young. Ellen Young in Ballarat was a woman who was writing letters and poems to the Ballarat Times that were being regularly published. She actually was the main mobilising voice behind the diggers' protest movement. She was a chartist from England. She'd had practice at it. They hadn't been able to achieve anything in England because women had been quite readily dropped from the political agenda, but was already schooled and literate in how to work the system in that way. And she found the perfect place in Victoria, the perfect mouthpiece. Clara Seacamp was the de facto wife of the Ballarat Times owner, and when he was arrested and became the only Eureka participant to be jailed in the aftermath, she took over the reins of the newspaper. She edited it. She's in fact Australia's first female newspaper editor. And her name is there. It says, we've reproduced it in there, printed and published by Clara Seacamp. And then there are other ways of looking back on what she was doing. So other newspaper reporters in the Argus, in the Geelong Advertiser, were reporting things that she was writing. And in fact, one of them says, could the Attorney General please release Henry Seacamp from incarceration so that we can be free of this, I have to get it right, so that we can be saved from this free press petticoat government. Because he was so sick of Clara Seacamp's ranting and raving.
Because she didn't stint in editorialising,
She did not stint in her editorials.
No.
And so women were actively contributing to the press. Now, there's one other thing, though, that I will say about the suppression afterwards, is that the fact that women were involved in the stockade and that they were in the stockade itself, that the government had fired on women, children, that was very quickly buried from both sides. And I have my own theories as to why that was, but there was, I would say, at that point, an active suppression of the idea that women were participants.
Yes, hello Claire, Bernie's my name.
Hi Bernie, I've got a son called Bernie, it's a great name.
Yeah, it's a great name, isn't it? I'm a direct descendant of Anastasia Withers.
Are you?
Who was reported to be one of the sewers of the flag.
Yes.
And in all your research, have you found that in fact is correct, or it's always been in our family that that she and my mother has written history books about this, and but there's always been some doubt as to whether she was the AW, that the initials down on the bottom left-hand side of the flag. Yep. So, could you make a comment, please?
I've done quite a lot of work on the flag. I can't prove or disprove that any one individual woman was involved. I have no doubt that more than one woman, and certainly more than 3 women, were involved. So there are 3 that are commonly named: Anastasia Hayes, Anastasia Withers and Anne Duke, who was 15 at the time and pregnant with her first child. And Anastasia Hayes was also pregnant at the time with her sixth child, as Robyn quite correctly pointed out. There were a lot of pregnant women at the time, but I do think that there were more women than that. And there are other descendants who also claim that their family members were involved, and one of them I do particularly believe, and I've written her into the story. She's a descendant of the Howard family. Eliza Darcy was her name at the time. She married Patrick Howard in 1855. They went on to have 12 children, and their youngest child had a daughter, Ella Hancock, who is still alive today. She's 97 years old. So that is a granddaughter of somebody who was at Eureka. And the family story always was that Eliza helped sew the flag and that Patrick was involved in designing it. And it's actually a theory that I believe and that I argue for, and the reasons why in the book. They were a strong part of the Catholic community in Ballarat. I believe the flag was sewn in the Catholic Church. And Anastasia Hayes was also a part of that community. And there's been a lot of conservation work done on the flag since it's been replaced in the museum at Ballarat. It was being conserved over in Adelaide by very highly regarded materials conservators, and the woman who is in charge of that process has said to me that she thinks that the size that it is, the quality of the work, and the time that it would have taken them to sew it means that it's very likely that more than 3 women were involved in the sewing of it. So I have no reason to suggest that Anastasia Withers was not involved, but I think probably more than we have recognised in the past were involved.
We're getting close to 7:15. If someone has a very brief question, we could probably slip it in. Just here. Short question for a short answer.
Hello, Claire. My name's Lynn. I was born and bred in Ballarat, grew up with the whole story in my blood. I lived not far away from the new Ballarat cemetery where there was the big Chinese grave, and there was all sorts of Chinese influence in Ballarat, always has been. And I wondered, were the Chinese involved in the Stockade Rebellion? You don't hear much, and yet...
No, they were certainly involved in the community of Ballarat, and I talk about them, but I haven't found any evidence that they were actually involved
politically motivated.
That they were physically within the stockade.
Right.
It was... I mean, one of the reasons that the stockade happened is that on the 29th of November, there was the Ballarat Reform League called upon the miners to burn their licences. And on the very next day, the government sent out for a licence hunt, and things very quickly got very ugly, and there were shots fired by the government. The Riot Act was read. And so what they realised is that they needed to provide a safe house for unlicensed diggers. And that's essentially what the stockade was. They would provide armed defence to anybody who didn't have a licence, that they could come and they could be protected from any licence hunts that happened. I haven't found any evidence that any Chinese were involved in burning their licences, for example. They may or may not have been part of that kind of closed shop that was established when that action occurred. There are other immigrant groups that are definitely involved in it, however, and one of them that I have done quite extensive research on, again, that hasn't really been done in the past, is the role of Jews in the Ballarat Goldfields and in the Eureka Stockade, and they were very prominent in the movement.
Thanks, Claire. We're out of time. It's been a delight. Thanks. I'm in the lucky position of having read the book, and so you've really brought it to life, even more so than you did on the page. So thank you for that, Claire. For those who haven't read the book, you're going to have the opposite delight. Copies of the book are available courtesy of the Paperback Bookshop at the end of the room for sale, and Claire will be signing. I think that's what she's indicating to me there. Claire will be available to sign very shortly, so queue up, grab yourself a book, and Claire will be down there to make her mark shortly. And thank you all for coming out on this Thursday evening.